Good evening, everyone. Go ahead and get started. On Sunday, we started to go through Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 through chapter 2 and verse 10. When Paul starts to discuss his conversion, and we wanted to kind of address some sections of the text that people claim contradict Acts. I've never actually read this book, but there's a book called Forgery by a man named Bart Ehrman, and if you are familiar with textual criticism, you've heard of that name. He's an atheist, and again, I've not read the book, but I did read a second source that said that his claim is that Galatians and Acts are irreconcilable. They contradict each other, and there's no way to reconcile them. And without reading the book, I don't know exactly what his arguments are, but there's only so much chronology and history in Galatians that he could possibly be referring to in order to justify such a claim, and comparing to a parallel account in Acts. Namely, what we've been talking about here. So that's the nature of our discussion. You know, we're doing Galatians over the course of a quarter. It's only 6 chapters. So it's a natural thing to deal with. If this isn't the first time you've read Galatians or Acts, you read it, and it's a natural question to ask, is this the Acts 15 visit in Galatians 2? Okay, so that's the reason why we're doing it. The first thing we looked at was Paul's first visit to Jerusalem. Oh, I'm so honored. Joseph's first Bible class. Dad's going to love that. Good to see you back, Megan. So Paul's first visit to Jerusalem, some might claim that Luke's account of that historical event differs from Paul's autobiographical account of his first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion in his intention in going, who he saw there, and why he left, and whether or not he was actually seen by the Judean churches. And we dealt with those at length. One thing that I didn't mention is in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, the text says that 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem. 3 years after his conversion. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 23, it uses different language to describe the duration. Acts 9:23. It says, when many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. And some people will say, many days equals 3 years. 365 times 3? Yeah, I guess that's many. What's the chances? So you might want to mark in your Bibles 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 38. It's at least a biblical precedent for equating the two. 1 Kings chapter 2. Verse 38, Shimei then said to the king, the word is good. As my lord the king has said, so your servant will do. So Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days. But it came about at the end of 3 years that 2 of the servants of Shimei ran away to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. So it's not a stretch to equate the two descriptions of the same duration there. Okay, many days can be 3 years, folks. So that was kind of the first proposed contradiction that doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. When you're dealing with proposed contradictions, a few things to keep in mind. A lot of people argue from silence. Galatians says something, Acts doesn't say it, and Acts would have said it, or Acts says something that's not described in Galatians, and Galatians must have, therefore contradiction that just doesn't work. And then Galatians will give some detail, Acts will give some other detail, and people will claim that they're mutually exclusive. And if they are, they can't be both true at the same time and therefore contradiction. But the assumption that they are mutually exclusive doesn't hold water in every case, at least when we're talking about the Bible. Okay, so we started to ask this question: is Paul's visit being described in Galatians chapter 2, where he goes to Jerusalem 14 years later and he meets with the pillars, the men of repute, men of influence, depending on your translation, Peter, James, and John. The natural instinct is maybe Galatians 2 is this Acts 15 visit, the so-called council or conference. Same debate about circumcision, same general outcome, go to the Gentiles. They added nothing to Paul's gospel that he preached to them, which certainly included you don't have to be circumcised. Same people are involved, Paul and Barnabas, Peter and James. Paul's presentation seems to be the same. In Acts, he presents his case, what he preaches to the Gentiles. In Galatians, he does as well. And then the timing of things. And we talked about, no matter how you slice it, there's got to be a long stay in Tarsus. That is just not recorded in Acts. It's probably roughly 5 years here. This is, after his first visit to Jerusalem post-conversion, and he goes away to Syria and Cilicia, and then at some point, Barnabas comes and gets him, and they're in Antioch for a year before they go to Jerusalem for famine relief. Before Barnabas gets him, he must have been in Tarsus for quite a long time. It's a shorter time if you equate these two. If you equate these two events, it's a shorter time here, just by counting backwards by 14 years. It'd be roughly double that. If Galatians 2 is Acts 11, which is what we're going to talk about today, because if it wasn't this, then what could it be? There's a few reasons to doubt that it might be this. First of all, the letter's not mentioned. If they've already had this Jerusalem council, and Paul's had the decrees that he was supposed to be delivering to the churches, why not mention it? And we talked about this. It may well have been the case that Paul could have seen it to undermine the case that he's making, keep in context the point Paul's trying to make in all of this discussion. I was not influenced by man. My gospel is not according to man. I was not taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. That's the only reason he's even entertaining all of this history and detailing it for the members of the Galatian churches. And then the chronology. Okay, so Paul only mentions 2 visits to Jerusalem in Galatians. If Acts 15, or if this Galatians visit is Acts 15, then that doesn't add up, because there was a visit before that one in Acts 11 when Paul and Barnabas go to deliver famine relief. And so that's what a lot of people think is the case, is that Galatians 2 is actually this Acts 11, not all, famine relief visit. So in support of this, people will say chronology. Basically everyone that's not here, any argument against this case might support this one. The chronology, this would be the second recorded visit in Galatians. It's the second recorded visit in Acts. Okay, QED. Of course, the rebuttal to that is, well, Paul is not giving you a sequence of events. He's only telling you substantial interactions he had with men of influence, because that's his point in entertaining these visits in the first place, is to demonstrate that he wasn't influenced by anyone. So that would be the rebuttal to that one. Let's see, another one is the sequence of events. So we know that right after the Galatians 2 visit, if you look in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 9, they extend the right hand of fellowship so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So it seems like it's, hey, we're in agreement. All right, do your mission. And in Acts 11, right after the famine relief case, first missionary journey to the Gentiles. So sequence of events, maybe. That sort of adds up. However, we know that Paul was preaching before his first missionary journey. He was preaching in Damascus when he first got converted. Luke writes about that. And, he was threatened by the opposition group in Damascus because he was preaching this stuff. And people wanted him out for that reason. So it's not to say the first time Paul preached certainly was not in the first missionary journey. Of course, it's here as well in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 22. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea which were in Christ, but only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. People were saying that when he first went back to Jerusalem after his conversion. Paul was preaching the whole time. The third one people say is the reason for going up. So people will say, in Acts chapter 11, why did Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem? Famine relief funds, but it was because this prophet Agabus said, hey, there's a famine coming. Collect funds, bring it down there, and prepare for this impending famine. And Paul says in Galatians 2, it was because of a revelation that I went up. And so people say it's because of similar reasons. Although, when Paul talks about things being revealed to him in a divine sense like that, it always deals with the gospel. At least in every other instance. This would be the one exception. So that's what people will say in argument against that one. There's a few reasons why you might doubt this one. One, the long Tarsus visit. It'd be 10 years there. Again, it's possible. It's just that, when Luke records it, he goes away to Syria and Cilicia, and then just like a few verses later, he says nothing about what Paul did in Syria. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a long time. It's just that it would be a long time to have not recorded anything. So, timing again. Another one is this. If Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem in Acts 11 and deliver the famine relief funds, and then they impromptu have this discussion about circumcision. If that's what's happened, if Paul is talking about the Acts 11 famine relief visit in Galatians 2, which certainly came before Acts 15, it seems like the circumcision debate had been settled before Acts 15. And so for the same reasons that people say, why wasn't the Acts 15 letter mentioned in Paul's argument to these people? You might say, why wasn't this debate in Acts 11, which apparently happened if Galatians 2 is Acts 11? Why wasn't that brought up in Acts 15? It seems like whenever Peter and James and Paul get up to speak in Acts 15, they would say, hey guys, remember 2 years ago when we had this debate? We settled that, right? That's not what they do. Basically, Acts 15 before Acts 15 doesn't quite, some might take issue with that. Number 3, kind of like how people say the Acts 15 letter is unmentioned. It's not mentioned in Galatians 2. If this meeting happened in Acts 11, it's not mentioned. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's an argument from silence. But just saying. There's a few other ones. We don't have a whole lot about his ministry before Acts 11. Some people will point to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 13. I know, Joseph. Galatians 4:13. But you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. Some of you probably have preached to you before. So, one thing that's stated is if he's referring to a first time, it sort of implies a second one. There's a couple responses to that. It could be translated preached to you before, which doesn't necessitate a second time. Also, on his first missionary journey, he went to some of these churches twice on the first missionary journey, right? He passes through Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, turns around, and hits some of the same cities on his way back through Cyprus and so on. So he would have seen some of them twice on that one visit. The last one is, so on this 14 years and 3 years business, is he referring to, in each instance, back to his conversion? As if to say, I didn't go to Jerusalem until 3 years after I was converted, and then 14 years later, that is 14 years now after my conversion. Or is he saying 3 years after my conversion, and now 14 years after that second visit, whenever that was? So if you start to use some external references to times, right? Jesus must have died around 30 to 33 AD. Okay, so you look at when certain people were procurators in secular historical accounts. And this guy, King Aretas, was a king in Damascus, that area, and he told an ethnarch to send Paul away. That's why Paul was sent out of Damascus. It was because a king named Aretas gave that order to whoever was ruler in Damascus. And Paul tells you that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Okay, so there's secular history that can identify when this Aretas guy must have been, in command or ruling or whatever. And if you start to backtrack 14 years, it's going to like put Paul being converted before Jesus died. So that's why some people will say, well, it's not 14 years since his conversion. It's not 14 years since the second visit. It's 14 years since his conversion. And that extra 3 years is enough to make it work. Okay. Everyone's eyes are open? Great. And that was tough. Believe me. It's just kind of like, can't not talk about that when you're doing Galatians across 6 weeks, right? Anyway, David Roper's not here to defend this one. I know he feels he's advocated it for it on 2 occasions now. So David, I'll talk to you later about it. Okay, any questions on timing of events? In either case, no one can make the claim that they're talking about different things or they disagree. There's strong evidence that it's one of the two, and I'm not convinced that it has any bearing on doctrinal truth.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
I think kind of just stepping back from it, the pacing of specifically Acts can seem very quick, but I think one takeaway is they were spending a lot of time at these places. It kind of, when you're just reading through it, it feels like, oh, they were here and they moved on to here and they moved on to here. But they were staying in places 3 or 4 years here, a few years here. And I just think taking that into account of Paul was investing a lot of time in building relationships with people. And it wasn't just like he was popping in, talking for, in a few cases there was brief visits. But that's just always stuck out to me that we think of evangelizing as quick outcomes, but we can see that even in Paul's evangelizing it, he was spending a lot of time with these churches and building it over time.
No matter how you slice it, it's either 14 or 14 plus 3. Where were you 17 years ago? That's a long time ago. A lot happens. You've changed a lot in 17 years. Think about that. If Paul didn't go on that first missionary journey for a decade, it's not like he had his nose in the book, he was preaching, and but that's still, it's not like Paul went on his first missionary journey immediately after. The point is well made. Anything else? Okay, so now let's talk about what actually matters in this section. The point that Paul is trying to make is that he was not influenced by anyone. And there's a few key phrases, right? In 1:16, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. 1:17, I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. And then 3 years later. What is being emphasized in all that? As soon as Paul gets converted, I didn't go to Christian school. I didn't go and talk to the apostles. I didn't go to Bible class. I went away into Arabia. And we can talk about what Arabia is. Basically, no one knows. Maybe it's the Arabia that he refers to in chapter 4 in the Hagar-Sarah allegory, Mount Sinai. But not necessarily. That's not the point. The point is away. I didn't talk to anyone. Okay, so Paul's not interested in hearing what Peter has to tell him right away. I know what Jesus just told me, and this is changing my life. Imagine the trajectory that Paul was on. You know why he was going to Damascus in the first place. But he doesn't consult with flesh and blood. He goes away. And then 3 years later, he mentions that to tell you it's a significant amount of time before I went to Jerusalem. I didn't see those guys for 3 years. They couldn't have told me what to say. And even when I was there, I was only there for 2 weeks. I didn't see anyone except for Peter, stayed with him 15 days, saw no one else except James. And I was still unknown by sight to all the churches that are in Judea. Okay, so after 3 years, I see hardly anyone. And when I am in a place where I might be influenced, I spoke basically to no one. Okay? Peter and James, and even that was an insignificant amount of time. And then he gives you the event 14 years later. Now, this is a substantial interaction, and he wants to tell you that. But what are the key phrases about the interaction in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 that indicate that Paul uses to tell us he was not influenced by what they say? What are the key phrases in verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2?
When you talk about adding nothing to him.
Okay, that's
important.
Nothing was added to me. I did have substantial interactions with them. But nothing that they told me was different than what I had already preached to you, my beloved Galatian friends. What else? The other one, I think, is when he says, we did not yield in subjection to them. Not even for an hour, he wants to say. What's that? Oh, that's in verse 5 of chapter 2. The false brethren there are wanting to circumcise Titus, who was a Greek. It seems like Paul brought him there as a case in point, maybe. But he did not yield in subjection to them even for an hour. And we get some insight into Paul's love for the Galatians. He says, I did that to preserve the gospel for you. It seems like they were on his mind. I've just spent all this time preaching to you. They were on his mind while he's having this interaction with these folks in Jerusalem. And it just furthers the point, the care and the concern that Paul had for the people that he preached to. So I think those are the main takeaways from this entire section. Paul has developed a pretty concrete argument to support and probably rebut the objection that was maybe actually being levied. That poses a question in chapter 1 and verse 10. Any other comments or questions from this section? Lots of verses. Galatians 1:15 through 2:10.
Was there any distinction, or what's the distinction between it talks about the other apostles going to the circumcised or the Jews, and then Paul going to the Gentiles? But at the beginning, he goes through a lot of work to talk about one gospel. So,
Well, what do we know? We know that Paul went to synagogues. So it's not like he didn't preach to Jews. But it seems like he had a special mission for the Gentiles. And this is, evidenced everywhere. Paul can't hardly not write about it in any letter that he writes. Let's look at a few of these. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 15. The first time we learn of Paul's conversion, Acts chapter 9, verse 15. But the Lord said to him, Go, speaking to Ananias, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings of the sons of Israel. I'll show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Okay. Specific mission to the Gentiles. Romans chapter 1 and verse 5. Paul speaking, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake, among whom you also are, the called of Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 6. Ephesians 3 verses 6 through 8. To be specific, talking about this, the mystery that was this mystery that was sort of in the Old Testament scriptures, but that's now been revealed. To be specific, what is it, Paul? That the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel, of which I was made a minister, according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me according to the working of his power. To me, the very least of all saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of his grace. Paul understood the mission that was given to him by God. It was specifically to go to the Gentiles. Now, does that mean that Peter didn't preach to Gentiles? Of course not. I mean, the first recorded preaching to the Gentiles is with Cornelius, and that was Peter. So I don't know. I don't think it's the case that that it was exclusively Paul to Gentiles and exclusively Peter and James and whoever else to the Jews. It's kind of like Joe has developed this relationship with this particular African ministry. And it makes sense for Joe to do that. He knows the people there. He has the relationships. He's done it before. And so it seems to me it's like, obviously, spreading the gospel is a generic term and a generic mission for all of us. But Paul was given a specific mission, and the apostles in Jerusalem have identified apparently a specific mission for them to go to the circumcised. Again, that doesn't mutually exclude the more generic mission, I don't think. All right, what about this in verse 2? When Paul says, of chapter 2, Paul says, "It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain." How would you describe this fear that Paul has that he might have been or is running in vain? In what sense might it have been in vain or continue to be in vain?
Them not listening.
Okay, them not listening. Who? Who's the them?
The Gentiles.
The Gentiles, okay. So I need to go down to Jerusalem to see if I've been running in vain, to see if the Gentiles aren't listening is, okay? Yeah, maybe. Maybe he'll go there and learn from someone else that these places that he's been preaching, that is one sense in which his work could be in vain, certainly, for him to preach and no one listen. Yeah.
I mean, I read it more like he's wanting to talk with the leaders there and make sure that they're not preaching something different or endorsing something different than what he's sharing.
Okay.
So that it's not in vain. It's not like, I've preached this over here, and I'm here talking to you leaders, and you're not supporting this.
Okay.
So I'm going to meet with you privately and make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So make sure that what I'm preaching up here is not being subverted down here.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the sense in which he means, let me make sure this isn't in vain. The other sense in which it could be in vain is, have I been preaching the wrong thing? But it's certainly not the case. Paul is confident in the truth of the gospel that's been revealed to him. He's not saying, let me go down here and check with Peter and James and get their stamp of approval. He doesn't need that. Jesus gave that to him. He's going to make sure, like has been said, that what he's teaching is not being subverted in Jerusalem. Let's notice some characteristics that Paul gives to the false teachers. Chapter 2 and verse 4. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. Okay, so several characteristics that Paul is careful to characterize the false teachers as. What do you walk away with there?
Snake.
Yes, a snake. Yeah, and it rhymes with sneak. Does it?
No, it's snake.
Not really. Acronym?
Anagram.
Anagram, okay. Yeah, sneak, snake.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I were writing a poem, I'd probably use those to rhyme. Yeah, so they're sneaking in. They were secretly brought in. I mean, what I gather is when there are false brethren, it's often not without ill motives. They're coming in for the wrong reasons. It's not an accident when this sort of thing happens. It's intentional. It is with an end goal in mind, and that's very dangerous. Okay, all the language about wolves in sheep clothing is appropriate here for understanding, how the Bible talks about false teaching. Comment, yeah.
I think there's a difference between a misguided brother and a false brother. Because
Sure.
a misguided brother could be the person that has good motives, but they're just off base and they might realize, oh, I made a mistake. A false brother is someone who comes in whose their allegiance is not to the gospel. And so, but they're not presenting it that way, but
Yeah.
that's different.
I think Ben preached on this recently, where he talked about in the series on unity, where he was talking about there may well be a new convert who is learning things and thinks a certain thing that might be different, and it's something that person needs to be instructed on, but that doesn't make them a false teacher. They have some growing to do. That's very different than the person who has an end goal. I mean, that's the thing to me, the purpose behind it, the non-accidental nature of their efforts. It's with ill intent from the beginning. And I think that's often the case here. Even if some people are deceived by themselves, their motives may be even hidden from themselves because it's as deep as pride and monetary gain and elevating status, which is difficult to identify even in ourselves. But I think it certainly influences many false teachers today. And if they could use the mirror that James talks about and identify this blemish and separate themselves from their selfish ambition and envy, the wisdom that's not from above in James 3, then maybe they would be able to identify it and recognize their motives actually are poor from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back, like if you look at verse 4 and you think about that, the one that's misguided or a babe in Christ who's still learning and figuring out how these things work, isn't one that is sneaking in or spying or doing this secretly. That's not the words you would use to describe that situation. So there's a real intent and underhandedness to this, and like you said, with a goal.
Yeah.
With a goal of corrupting and disrupting the gospel.
Yeah, and I think that obligates us to take preparation very seriously. If they're motivated to reach their end goal, like we can't come in there haphazardly and underestimate how that engagement, how that interaction with them might go. We need to be prepared. Here's the last comment I wanted to make. The right hand of fellowship is extended. Okay. So I think this is to the point that Julie was making. They're in agreement. They're supporting each other. The thing that I want to observe is, on what basis was the right hand of fellowship extended? When you've read through all of Galatians now 3 times, on what basis was agreement and associating with them as brethren? On what basis was that conclusion finally come to?
The grace he received was from God.
They recognized the grace that had been given to him as having come from God. Okay, there's another one. That's one of them. There's that comes after an and, right? And recognizing grace. What's the first point made?
It says when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me.
When they saw that I had been entrusted with a specific mission, then that was the case. Yeah. So what criteria should be considered when we evaluate whether or not to support a missionary? I mean, is it consistent with the Bible? That's not difficult. I mean, that's what they did in this case, to recognize Paul. I mean, think about this. How often had Peter engaged with Paul before this? 15 days. That's it. 15 days. Okay, are we on the same page? Yes, we are. How do I know? Because what you're teaching is consistent with the truth of the gospel. And if that's all we know, then we can support that brother. But that must be known to support them. Seems to be the idea here. All right. On Sunday, we're going to look at verses 11 through 14. Your theme read is on the idea of reputation. And I think it's especially, we didn't talk much about them being called pillars or the men of influence, but Paul is talking about other people's perspective of Peter and John. And, I need to listen to them because they're men of influence. And we can be, that's not the reason to listen to someone. And so Paul has a lot to say about people's reputation among men and that influencing them, and us being influenced by someone because they appear to be a man of influence. And so read through Galatians this week, identify some ideas toward that theme, and come prepared to talk. And it's especially appropriate as we deal with verses 11 through 14 in chapter 2. All right, see y'all Sunday.